Sophie Hardy in the Internet Implant by Emma Dale. Narrated by Leona Hall. Chapter 18. In at Dinner. Plans scuppered and feeling helpless, Sophie and Yasmin were once again marching down the corridor at school. This time, though, they were heading towards Mr. Houghton's office, not away from it. Surely he had realised what they'd been up to and was now going to prevent them from going to look for Clara on their lunch break. On top of that, poor Katie was being dragged along now with no prior knowledge of anything. Their original plan for lunchtime was certainly over. Panicked, Sophie began to imagine what kind of hellish torture Mr. Houghton might have in store for them. As Miss Sissons had explained, and King had backed up, he was one of the most dangerous men in the known worlds. Eventually, they reached the end of the corridor and Mr. Houghton's lumbering figure turned the handle to his office door. Mrs. Tabard, who was on her way out to do dinner duty, tutted and said, "Are you staying in again, girls?" Mr. Houghton replied, "Oh, nothing serious, Mrs. T." She then scurried off to go and take care of a spillage in the dining hall. All three girls carried their English books and pen. However, they knew their punishment was going to be much worse than having to write a few extra lines. At least Sophie and Yasmin did. And what of Clara? Who knew what kind of hellish mess she was in and how much longer she could survive? A drip of sweat appeared on Sophie's forehead and trickled down. Nervous, the three girls lined up next to Mr. Houghton's desk and waited to see what was coming their way. Mr. Houghton sat down on his huge chair and leant over to the side of his desk to open a drawer. Sophie began to wonder what possible implement a man as dangerous as Mr. Houghton would use on people that had gone behind his back. Sophie and Yasmin just stood next to his desk, petrified. Katie still just looked confused. "Sit down," Mr. Houghton said in a deep voice. Sophie had never found his voice threatening or scary before, but right now it reverberated around her ears like a never-ending thunderclap. The girls sat on the spare seats, all of them looking solemnly at the floor. Mr. Houghton took something out of his drawer and closed it gently. He was taking the lid off something, and with a pop, he succeeded. Within an instant, Mr. Houghton had picked up his equipment of impending doom and spun round in his chair. "Biscuit?" he offered. Sophie and Yasmin simply stared at the tub and were faced with nothing except for a selection of biscuits for them to choose from. Without waiting to be asked twice, Katie reached out and took one. Sophie and Yasmin sat there, speechless. Sophie was desperate to say phew, but couldn't bring herself to. Her heart was pounding like a racehorse in her chest. She half expected it to burst out at any second. "No, thank you," Yasmin squeaked. Sophie merely shook her head, not taking her eyes off the biscuits. "Don't you like them?" Mr. Houghton asked. "Not hungry," was Sophie's reply. "Oh, that's a shame. It's dinner time, and you don't want anything? Never mind." Mr. Houghton put the lid back on and put the tub back in his desk. He span back round again. "We all know why we're here," Mr. Houghton began. Katie nodded and started taking her pen out of her pocket, went to start writing, but then slowly put it back when she saw that no one else had taken theirs. Sophie and Yasmin stayed rigid. "I don't know what Miss Sissons has told you girls, but I assure you it isn't how it happened, and I am not who she says I am," Mr. Houghton said in a tone completely unfamiliar to the girls. "She said you're greedy, and you want to be applauded for doing your duty," Sophie began. "You want street parades and huge celebrations just for doing your job. Police officers, firefighters, and loads of others keep people safe, but you got everyone to think that you're better than them and that you and your workers should be treated differently." Sophie finished her rant. Yasmin had turned to look at her with a look of, "I didn't know you had it in you." "And?" Mr. Houghton replied. This bamboozled Sophie. She'd been expecting a huge tirade of shouting and screaming and general evilness, but it didn't come. As a result, she had to think on her feet. "It's wrong," was the best she could come up with. "It's wrong for brave men and women to want to be recognised for risking their lives. Police officers and firefighters, to use your example, can get their names in the papers or medals, and they certainly get paid a lot more than my agents did. The people I work with got next to nothing for what they did." Mr. Houghton remained extremely calm. He had clearly used this argument many times before. Sophie had no comeback to this. Yasmin was lost for words, and Katie didn't seem to have a clue what anyone was talking about, so the three girls stayed quiet. "Has Miss Sissons told you about the inventions and technology that are available at Shadow?" Mr. Houghton asked, slightly changing the subject. "There is technology in there that could put an end to world hunger. Poverty could become a thing of the past. Men, women and children all over the world don't need to die unnecessarily. But King has destroyed most of it because they needed people to operate them, all in an effort to stop my people from being recognised. He was wrong." His tone was getting decidedly darker. "We could change the world for the better, but he won't risk that company of his." "We've seen some of it," Yasmin said. then you know there are incredible things there, life-changing things, world-changing things, and King won't share them. All I wanted was for people on Earth to be better off and looked after, my agents included. But King and his unwillingness to allow those that did such an amazing job to be recognised and rewarded stopped all that. There were clearly things that Miss Sissons and King hadn't told Yasmin and Sophie. That or Mr. Houghton was lying. However, he had had the same look on his face and passion in his voice that Miss Sissons had had when she was telling her version of events. The truth must have been part way between the two. Sophie weighed up what she'd heard. There must have been a downside to all these solutions. King wouldn't have just stopped you because he didn't want you to be famous. Not that I know of. Ask King and Miss Sissons yourself. King said there was a risk of some of the agents getting a bit carried away with their popularity, but I had faith in them. Upon hearing this, Sophie began to feel torn. If there were solutions to all these problems, starvation, poverty to name just two, then why were Miss Sissons and King holding back? It didn't make sense. Surely it was worth the risk of some agents becoming famous. Conflicted, aren't you? Mr. Houghton asked. Surprisingly, it was Yasmin who jumped in while Sophie sat still deep in thought. No, I don't think you've told us everything. You're not telling us something. Yasmin, I am keeping nothing from you. Mr. Houghton was back to being his calm self, and Sophie found herself believing him. She remained deep in thought while Yasmin kept probing. Why choose us? Why did we get an implant? You keep talking about a competition. That was all you, she exclaimed. Just because King and I disagree, it doesn't mean we disagree on everything. We agreed that if the agency was to be rebuilt, it would be with children at its core. In the conversations that Sissons, King and I have had, we have all agreed on that. The three of us also agreed that it would be Clara first, followed by you two. I'm sure Sissons and King have told you this. Not exactly, Yasmin replied. What about Reuben? He's my son. I wanted him to have the best. Getting King to agree to him having an implant wasn't difficult when I told him I would return Clara. He ruined that though when Clara tried to contact you, Sophie. She and King clearly had something they were hiding, some hidden plan, trying to ruin me and get her out without me knowing. Mr. Houghton relaxed on his chair. He was certainly convinced of everything he was saying. See, Yasmin, I have nothing to hide. Ask me anything, and I will tell you the truth. You are the future. On that we all agree. But it would be better under my guidance, not that ancient King or that maverick Sissons. They can make you good. I can make you legends, Mr. Houghton said. Where's Clara? Sophie finally snapped out of her deep thought. She knew the answer, and so did Yasmin, but Mr. Houghton didn't know that she knew. This would be a perfect way to test if he was lying. Pardon, Sophie? Where is Clara? Sophie asked again, a lot more impatiently. She's at home, where she's been for the last 6 weeks. Mr. Houghton's answer matched what Sophie and Yasmin had found out at Shadow not 2 hours ago. Why? Sophie asked. She is lying perfectly safe on her bed, Sophie. Physically, she is more than fine. Mentally, though, time is definitely not on her side, shall we say. Take her back. I won't stop you. It's been fun watching her suffer, and she's not much use to me now anyway. Reuben is definitely ready to become famous. Then I can have everything I ever wanted. Mr. Houghton was reaching new levels of deceitfulness, using his own son to achieve his personal goals. Sophie jumped up from the seat and grabbed Yasmin's hand. Come on, I know what's happening with Clara and what he's done to her. Reaching out for the door handle, Sophie heard Mr. Houghton say one final thing. If you do start to see things more from my perspective, do come and find me. Katie stayed sat down, not invited by her friends who had left her. She just asked Mr. Houghton, Do I still need to finish this? Showing him her literacy book. Yes, Mr. Houghton said, but Sophie heard nothing more as the door to his office closed. Yasmin and Sophie ran down the corridor towards the classroom. When they reached it, they threw open the door and Sophie immediately shouted at Miss Sissons. I know why we haven't heard from Clara. I know what's happened to her. We have to go, now. Do you? We can't go now. There's no safe place to zone out, Miss Sissons said frantically. Sophie sounded very grown up when she replied with, There has to be. Every second is making a difference to Clara. We have to go, now. Sophie was fired up now. She glared at Miss Sissons for trying to stop her from finding Clara. If she'd been a bit more disrespectful and disobedient, she would have just walked out of school and gone to Clara's house to get her. It was an impossible choice. On the one hand, she wanted nothing more than to go around to her cousin's house and help her. On the other, she knew that the amount of trouble she would be in, both with school and her parents, would be incredible. Being only 10, Sophie still had lots of respect for authority, and although she knew Miss Sissons wasn't preventing her because she wanted to, she couldn't help but feel annoyed at her lack of determination. Time dilators, Yasmin asked. Surely we have the time. Miss Sissons looked apologetic. Where are we going to zone out? We got away with it at break time because we were only gone for 30 seconds real time. Mr. Houghton might have known what we were doing, but he never had time to get to the classroom to stop us. We could be gone now for a few minutes this time. What if an infant child comes into the classroom, sees us on the chairs and tells Mr. Houghton we have fainted like yesterday? The consequences of that could be catastrophic. Not only that Mr. Houghton now knows what we're up to and could just walk in and bring us round, we seriously can't go and rescue Clara because of the possibility of some 5-year-olds coming into the room? Yasmin asked. Correct, Yas. If we could guarantee to be back in seconds, no problem, but we can't be sure of that, Miss Sissons replied. Yasmin shook her head in disbelief, and Sophie's breathing was getting deeper and the frustration was really building up inside her. Behind her, the door opened and Katie started to say, "What was all that? Get out!" Sophie screamed at her. Katie sheepishly closed the door and walked back up the corridor with tears in her eyes. Yasmin made for the door to go after her, but Sophie interjected again. "Leave her. You're with us. We need to work out what to do." Yasmin wasn't used to being bossed about and so tutted and gave Sophie a bit of a dirty look. Fortunately, Sophie didn't notice her. She was too deep in thought. "Where exactly is Clara?" Miss Sissons asked. "She's in her bedroom, lying on her bed, according to Mr. Houghton," Sophie snapped. "Right where both the map showed me and where Mr. Houghton said she was." "He told you she was there," Miss Sissons replied. "Yes, he didn't lie to us about that," Yasmin added. The three of them stood there in silence for a few seconds before Miss Sissons asked the question that both she and Yasmin were both thinking. Why doesn't she just get up? Because she's got one of these on her and can't take it off. Sophie reached into her pocket and pulled out the time dilator that Miss Sissons had used on her at break time. Miss Sissons and Yasmin stared at it for a few seconds, and suddenly they both realised what Sophie was talking about. "She's trapped in one of these with time racing by faster than ours. It might be that 1 minute for us is a week for Clara. She disappeared 6 weeks ago. To her it could be 6 months, 6 years or 6 decades. Sophie was talking unbelievably quickly now. "What about your uncles?" Yasmin asked. "Well, if they found out that time was speeding up, their lives wouldn't make sense. Did I see its shadow a time dilator that slowed down time for the person wearing it?" Yasmin asked Miss Sissons. Miss Sissons thought for a second, then said, "Yes, if they have those on, they might think they've only been sat there for about 5 minutes, when really they've been there for about 6 weeks. They would have no clue that anything was wrong." "Why haven't any of them starved or died from lack of water?" Yasmin asked. "All implants come with built-in nutrition chips," Miss Sissons said. "They would have no clue that they were hungry." "Why did it look like Clara was in a prison being tested when I saw her?" Sophie asked. "No idea," Miss Sissons replied, a little less convincingly than she'd been speaking before. "Let's get her and find out. Well, after school." Yasmin and Sophie both rolled their eyes, but Sophie knew that if she, the most famous 10-year-old on the planet right now, left school early for no reason, then someone on the street would spot her, take a photo of her, upload it, and all of a sudden people would be following her everywhere, wondering why she wasn't at school as she should be. She would get grounded for the rest of her life. "Is there no way we can get in touch with her to let her know we're coming?" Sophie asked. "I'll get King on it now," Miss Sissons said. Miss Sissons zoned out and reappeared seconds later. "Done," she said. Yasmin had her thinking face on. It consisted of scrunched up eyes and pursed lips. "So, for Clara, time is passing by more quickly, but for her dad's, time is passing really slowly because Mr. Houghton attached time dilators to them?" she asked. Sophie nodded and could see that Yasmin was still deep in thought. "What are you thinking?" Sophie asked. "Why didn't you faint yesterday at break time? Mrs. Tabard doesn't have an implant, so she was okay, but you clearly have one, but you didn't react yesterday," Yasmin asked randomly. Something clicked inside Sophie as she also realised this. She turned and looked at Miss Sissons as if to further prompt her for an answer. They hadn't been confident enough to ask her yesterday, but now they knew the full story, they had no problem asking her. "I made some alterations to the coding in my implant. The changes and installations I made me unreachable. It's like I'm off the system. Not even Mr. King has tech as good as mine and his. You'll find that if you search for me, I never come up, but I can reach you. That's why Clara couldn't contact me. Your implants have some of my plugins built in. That's how you, Yaz, managed to use a time dilator at break without having one stuck in your head like Sophie. Yours is built in." "Why would you not want to be reached?" Yasmin asked. "If I could be reached, what do you think I would face when I logged in properly? I'll tell you what. A barrage of messages from the avatars of former agents who've been uploaded somewhere that I can't get to them, criticising me for doing what I did. I am better off alone. If I knew where they were, I could go and get them instantly, but I can't, and I just can't face their cries." Yasmin didn't respond. She just nodded. Miss Sissons wasn't being her usual animated self. Yasmin had touched a nerve, and both she and Sophie could see it and decided to leave it well alone. "So, are we stuck at school for the rest of the day?" Sophie asked quickly, changing the subject back again. Afraid so, Miss Sissons replied truthfully. But Clara could be ageing by the second, exclaimed Jasmine. Her mind might be, but her body will be fine. She'll physically be a normal 10-year-old whenever we go and get her. Unless we wait until her 11th birthday. Miss Sissons was waffling again now. OK, we get it, Sophie said, showing her frustration again. It was going to be a very long afternoon for the three of them. The Sophie Hardy Saga was written and produced by Emma Dale and narrated and produced by Leona Hall. If you enjoyed it and would like to continue to follow the adventures of Sophie and her friends in coming episodes, then please subscribe through one of the many podcast providers out there. The links for each of these can be found on our website. If you require more information, visit our many social media channels, or if you would like to purchase a hard copy of the book, then be sure to check out www.sophiehardysaga.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy.